Hey guys, how's it going? Chet here, and welcome to another installment of my music theory series. Today's lesson is all about harmonizing the major scale. First, we're going to discuss exactly what that means and why it's useful to know, and then you're going to learn exactly how to do it. First off, having a strong understanding of what the major scale is a prerequisite to this lesson. So if you haven't checked out the previous video in this series, I highly recommend that you do, so that you have a strong grasp of what the major scale is and how to construct it. This music theory series is designed to cover everything from the complete basics all the way to more advanced concepts, and I'll be doing this by breaking everything down into simple bite-sized chunks in a clear and logical way. So if music theory is something that you've always struggled to get to grips with, or you're just looking to brush up on a few ideas, then make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any future lessons. Right, so straight into today's lesson. So what is harmonizing the major scale? Well, basically, all it is building chords off of each note in the major scale, making sure that all of the notes in the chord that you're building belong to the key itself. This means that harmonizing the major scale essentially gives you all of the diatonic chords that exist within the key. Now, why is this important?
What's in it for me?
From a composer's or songwriter's perspective, clearly knowing all of the chords that belong to a key provide a really good starting point to be able to choose chords that fit or sound good together within a chord progression. When soloing or improvising, knowledge of the harmonized major scale can actually be used in reverse to quickly work out the key that you're actually playing in. You can do this by first identifying the chords of the progression and the function that each of them possess, and then you can determine the corresponding key by seeing which harmonized major scale gives you those chords with those specific functions. For example, let's say that we have a chord progression that goes from F major to G major and then finally to C major. By having a good understanding of the harmonized major scale, I know that two major chords, one tone apart, only exist when the chords are the fourth and fifth chords of a key. That means that F major must be the 4 chord and G major must be the 5 chord of the key. It also indicates that the 1 chord, and in turn the key itself, is actually C major, which makes sense when we're looking at this chord progression because we have a common resolution from the 5 chord G to the 1 chord C, which is a perfect cadence. Now once the key has been determined, this obviously creates a lot of freedom for the musician playing over the chord progression. They'll now be able to make a more informed decision on the note choices they use within their solo. The harmonized major scale can even be used as a framework to actually do this. Make sure you check out my video on the second level of mastering your triads, and you'll see exactly how to practice and apply this concept on the guitar to help create more sophisticated solos. Okay, so we've established that harmonizing the major scale is pretty important and can be used to really open up harmony and take your playing to the next level. But how do you actually go about constructing the diatonic chords from the notes of the major scale? There's a few different ways to do this, and they all yield different chords, some more advanced than others. And these advanced chords we'll be exploring in future lessons. In this lesson, however, we're going from the basics, and we'll be focusing on how to harmonize the major scale to obtain the triads that are diatonic to the key. And it's actually pretty simple. So here we go. Obviously, the first place to start when harmonizing the major scale is actually with the major scale itself. We're going to be doing this in the key of C to keep things simple so that we can avoid using any accidentals. Later on in the lesson though, I'll be running through a few examples using some other keys. Now, the C major scale is C, D, E, F, G, A, B, and C. So let's harmonize the first note, which is C. Now, our aim here is to build triads from this scale, so each chord is going to have 3 notes. But how do we get these 3 notes? Well, starting from the note C, we're then going to miss the next note, which is D, and add the following note to our chord, which in this case is E. For the next note, we're going to do the exact same thing. We're going to miss a note, which is F, and add G to our chord. This process is called stacking thirds. It's called this due to the way the major scale is actually constructed. If we inspect the intervals between each of the notes we've picked, we'll see that the distance between C and E is 4 semitones, and that's a major third. If we then look at the distance between E and G, we'll see that's a distance of 3 semitones, which is called a minor third. And that's why it's called stacking thirds. Okay, so we've got our 3 notes. Now what type of chord is this? Now that brings us on to the definition of a major triad. A major triad is a 3-note chord which in root position has the lowest note being the root note of the major key, with the major third and perfect fifth stacked above it. In our example, we obviously meet the criteria for a major third, moving from C to E. But do we also have a perfect fifth? Well, a perfect fifth is the interval of 7 semitones, So the fact that we've stacked a minor third, which is 3 semitones, on top of a major third, which is 4 semitones, we now have a total of 7 semitones between C and G. So yes, we do have our perfect fifth, and we've actually constructed the C major triad. Now by convention, we often describe the notes of a chord by relating them to the major scale built off of the root note. We do this first by numbering the notes of the major scale from 1 to 7. This then allows us to associate the notes of the chord to the scale using these numbers. For the major triad, we have the 1, 3, and 5 of the scale. And that's because the third note of the major scale relative to the root is a major third. And the fifth note of the major scale relative to the root is an interval of a perfect fifth. This is the chord formula used to define all major triads. It's important to note that as the construction of the major scale is not specific to each key, the triad that's built off of the root note of the major scale is always going to be a major triad. The third note in any key is always 2 tones or 4 semitones away from the root note, and so is a major third. Likewise, the fifth note in any key is always 3.5 tones or 7 semitones away from the root note, and so is a perfect fifth. Now we have to harmonise the second note of the C major scale, and we can do this by stacking thirds as we did before. We start from D, miss the next note, which is E, and add F, giving us the first 2 notes of the triad. We then miss G and add A, giving us the final note. Now, as before, we analyse the intervals between each note of the chord. Between D and F, we have 3 semitones, and that's a minor third. Between F and A, we have 4 semitones, and that's a major third. Now this leads us to a new type of triad called a minor triad, and this is defined to be a 3-note chord which in root position has the lowest note being the root, with the minor third and perfect fifth stacked above. We've already identified that the interval between D and F is a minor third interval, and we also have the perfect fifth because we've stacked a major third on top of F to get to A. Now that's 3 semitones in the minor third interval and 4 semitones in the major third interval, giving us 7 semitones in total, which is a perfect fifth. So yes, we've constructed the D minor triad. Now the chord formula for a minor triad is the 1, flat 3 and 5 of the major scale built off of the root, and I'll demonstrate why that's the case. We have a D minor chord, so first we have to construct the major scale from the root note, which is D. So the D major scale is D, E, F sharp, G, A, B, C sharp, and then back to D to complete the octave. We obviously have the 1, which is D. Now if we look at the next note in our D minor chord, we have the note F. Comparing this with the D major scale, we can see that F is 1 semitone lower than the major third, or third note in the scale. Now, when flattening an interval by a semitone, we can refer to that interval as a flat interval, so in this case it's a flat 3. We then have the note A in our triad, which is the 5th note of the D major scale. So the chord formula for all minor triads is the 1, flat 3 and 5 relative to the major scale. As with the first chord, building a triad off the second note of the major scale is always going to give you a minor triad regardless of the key. The 4th note is always going to be 3 semitones above the second, and so a minor third, and the 6th note is always going to be 7 semitones above the second, and so a perfect fifth. Now we're going to continue this process of building triads by stacking thirds for the remainder of the notes in the C major scale. Beginning from the 3rd note, we obtain the notes E, G, and B, which are the 1, the flat 3, and the 5 relative to the E major scale. So that means we've just constructed the E minor triad. This also means that all triads built off the 3rd note of the major scale will be a minor triad. Building the next triad from the 4th note, which is F, we actually have to dip into the next octave, because we have F, miss a note, A, miss another note, and then C from the octave higher. Now, analysing that, we have the 1, the 3, and the 5 relative to the F major scale. So, we've constructed the F major triad. From the 5th note of the scale, we can do the exact same thing. We start off on the note G, we then miss a note and add B. We then have to dip into the next octave and add D. Now, relative to the G major scale, we have the 1, the 3, and the 5. So, we've built the G major triad. Building a triad off the 6th note of the scale, we obtain the notes A, C, and E. And relative to the A major scale, we have the 1, the flat 3, and the 5. And so we've constructed the A minor triad. Building a triad off of the 7th note, we have a slight change. we have the notes B, D, and F, and when analysing the intervals between each of these notes, we find that there's a minor third between B and D, and another minor third between D and F. That means there's now only 6 semitones between B and F, and this interval is called the diminished fifth or flat 5. This leads us to the final type of triad that's obtained from harmonising the major scale, and it's called a diminished triad. The chord formula for a diminished triad is the 1, the flat 3, and the flat 5 relative to the major scale built off of the root note. To demonstrate that, we build the B major scale because that's the root note of the chord we have. We then compare the notes of the triad with this scale. So the B major scale is B, C sharp, D sharp, E, F sharp, G sharp, A sharp, and B. The note B in the chord is obviously the first note of the B major scale, and so that's the 1. When looking at D, we can see that's a semitone lower than the third note of the scale, and so we can call it a flat 3. Likewise, F is a semitone lower than the fifth note in the scale, and that can be called a flat 5. Hence, the formula for a diminished triad is the 1, flat 3, and flat 5. That means the triad built off of the 7th note of the major scale is always going to be a diminished triad. So there you go, we've built a 3-note chord off of each note in the C major scale to obtain the following order of triads. The 1 is a major triad, 2 minor, 3 minor, 4 major, 5 major, 6 minor, and 7 diminished. As I've said before, and I'll say it again because it really is that important, because the major scale is always built using the same formula, irrespective of the note you're starting from, you will always obtain the same intervallic structure between note positions regardless of the key. That means the distance, for example, between the first and third notes is always going to be 2 tones or 4 semitones, and the distance between the 4th and 5th notes, for example, are always going to be a tone or 2 semitones, and so on and so on. That's why when we harmonise the major scale by stacking thirds, we will always obtain the same order of triads. If you were to remember anything from this lesson, it should definitely be this order of triads, and I'll put it on screen one more time because it is just that important. Now once you've memorised that order, all you'll need to know is the notes of the major scale that you want to harmonise, and you'll be able to obtain all of the diatonic triads within that key. And I'll give you an example using the key of A. So A major is the notes A, B, C sharp, D, E, F sharp, G sharp, and A. Now, applying the order of triads that we've got from harmonising the major scale, we then obtain the following chords. The 1 chord is A major, the 2 is B minor, 3 C sharp minor, 4 D major, 5 E major, 6 F sharp minor, 7 G sharp diminished, and then back to 8 to complete the octave, and that's A major. And there you go. That's how to harmonise the major scale by stacking thirds to obtain all of the diatonic triads within a key. Simple, right?
I want it so bad.
Now, as I said at the beginning of the video, there are loads of different ways of harmonising the major scale, and these methods can be used to obtain more sophisticated chords and sounds. For example, we could add a 4th note to the chord by stacking a further third on top of our triad to obtain 7th chords or tetrads. We could even stack our notes using different intervals, using 4ths and 5ths for example, to obtain quartal or quintal harmony. You can pretty much do it how you like, as long as you stick to the notes within the key. And by experimenting with these different methods, you can really discover some crazy ideas. We'll be exploring these different ways to harmonise the major scale in future videos, but that about covers it for this lesson. If you enjoyed this content and gained something from the video, I'd really appreciate it if you gave it a like and subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to also press the bell notification icon down below so you're the first to know when future lessons are out. Till next time guys, I'll catch you later.